All right, I want to talk about some of the common mistakes that you see in MongoDB. And the first one is the thing that I call don't link the documents. If you do a search for why to never use MongoDB, don't link the documents is one of the ones that's going to come up. Here's what you see in a lot of Mongo documents. You have a document that has some field. Let's call it reference ID. And later in some other document, you have something called input. And input has the reference ID between two documents. Now, the instant you have a link between two different documents based on an ID, it's not a document. You still have a referential integrity model that you're dealing with that needs to be modeled with some sort of normalized data. You need to use a real database, not a document store. If there's never a relationship between your documents to each other, like, you're storing, college papers or research papers, and there's no relationship between the two, it might make sense. And how common is this kind of a link? I'm working on a project right now with a company that has links exactly like I described between input IDs, output IDs, and reference IDs all the time. So what they have is they have a graph. They don't have documents. The second one I'm going to point you towards, and go and read some of these, is a nice article that has says that it has no use case. And one of these things that it talks about is schemaless systems. One of the claims to fame of MongoDB is that it doesn't have a schema, so you get to store whatever you want. Well, in reality, if you don't have a schema, then you need to use something like JSON schema to validate the schema of your documents before you put them in. And JSON schema doesn't check lots of things. It checks on certain structural properties of JSON because it's only semi-typed. And it doesn't check the validity of dates, which, if you want to store anything with dates, suddenly becomes really important. And there's no way to validate that if you're going to use an ID for a unique key field, that it's really an ID of the appropriate type, like a UUID. So it's not that strong in terms of schema checking. And the reality is that schemas, which is the data type of data that we're storing in the database, is relatively important to use a typed system because it catches all sorts of errors. So lack of schemas is a serious thing. Okay? This is one that I'm going to point you at. It doesn't say much about this, but it does talk about not using MongoDB because, yes, there is no security. You'll notice when we set up and we go through the process of setting up Postgres and the videos on setting up Postgres, that it takes a while to get Postgres installed and set up because I've got to turn on listening to the correct port. I've got to set the right kind of authentication. I have to work with this. I have to do that. It takes a bunch of effort to deal with not the database, but the security. And when we do our first things with MongoDB, you're not going to have any of that. You just go, install it, click, it's listening, I'm off. MongoDB is notorious for having security problems because it doesn't have any. There's no authentication, there's no validation of users, there's no password. It just here's your data. And if you do something wrong and you put here's your data on the web, guess what? Here's your data on the web and everybody in the world can see it. So, yeah. This one is, talks about the trends for doing data and how many should we have ever done MongoDB? This one is about 5 years old, but some of these things have been addressed, some of the limits in MongoDB, but by and large, the real kicker is this one. It's not ACID compliant, which means you have race conditions in your database and data is irreproducible. You can't determine what the source is or why it changed, and things can change in a constantly mutating fashion. And There are other alternatives if you really, really only want a JSON database like CouchDB that provide security, provide tracking, provide schema. So there's reasons why Mongo is just not that good. When and when not to use. You know, if you actually have something that has 0 joins in it, it might be possible to use Mongo. And if you don't, it's not a good choice. But I'm going to send you links to basically all of this. And Mongo is popular. I don't fall for the popular. I don't jump up and down and say, oh, just because it's popular, we should use it. Okay? And this has some cute cartoons in it. You know, another reason why Mongo is popular is because it builds indexes automatically. Now, indexes are not free, and it wants to index fields in your data. And although it builds them so that your searches are faster, if you do some searches on, say, field A, and you never use field A again for searching, you're still paying for the cost of that index. It doesn't reclaim them. It doesn't get rid of them. Every time you insert a document, it's adding to that index. It's using up the storage. It's using up the capability. It's not reclaiming it, and it's not tuning it to get rid of indexes. One of those things that we do in SQL databases like Postgres is we look at all the indexes that are unused and go, hey, shouldn't we just get rid of them? We pay for them. They take storage, they take time, and they slow down inserts. So, getting rid of indexes is an important piece too. This means that as your model evolves in MongoDB, you're still paying for all of those mistakes that you made earlier, unless you start over and completely reload your database from scratch. And so far, that's the only way to clean up and garbage collect a Mongo database, is a complete start over and reload the data. Now, the disadvantage of reloading the data is you see these IDs in the data. Those IDs are numbers, and they depend upon the time when that chunk of data was created, which means that you can never use them for anything if you're ever going to reload the data and clean it up, because the instant you do, you are going to get new IDs. And that reload is not a duplicate of your original. That reload is a new copy of the data with the garbage taken out and no indexes, which means you also pay for the fact that now you're going to have to prime the pump and create indexes all over again by a bunch of queries. But at least you can, in that fashion, deal with the lack of indexes. It turns out that for most business cases, now there are other things besides business data that we store, but for a lot of business cases, Mongo is a very poor choice. But let's say you're building a game and all you have is one set of data that's the top scores. Well, it might be a good choice to do Mongo. I mean, it's simple, it's quick. If you keep it behind a firewall and you don't never make mistakes with your security, or if your data doesn't really need to be that secure, as in its scores in a game, maybe it's a good choice. But my argument would be in most cases that Mongo is a good choice if you look at Redis as an in-memory store that can have backups and store its data permanently on disk, because it does have that capability, that Redis is scalable and faster than Mongo. Because it is in memory, we're talking, you're going from something that is a few thousand documents per second at the very best, to Redis on a single instance will do 250,000 to 500,000 updates per second. So it's a couple orders of magnitude faster. To give you some idea of the capability of something like Redis, And I worked with a company out in Utah that does a custom search. It's kind of like Google, but tuned for doing searches for businesses where they're referenced on the web, and keeps ongoing lists of where you've been referenced on the web. You pay for the service, they search it, which means they are searching the entire World Wide Web and feeding it through their processors. Between their robots that go out, their bots that go out and collect the data, and their back end, they have Redis. And in a cluster of 4 machines, they manage to pump a copy of everything that their entire World Wide Web search, and these are documents, they're not small, quite often 100K, gets pumped through a set of 4 Redis machines to act as a queue between the front end and the back end. So 4 machines running a cluster in Redis is enough to pump the entire World Wide Web every week through it. That's the kind of performance you have out of Redis. So if you just need a table and a list, take a look at Redis and how it works, because it's really, really fast. And that kind of takes the steam out of, what use case is Mongo good for. I will send you those links, and I'd like you to at least read down through some of them, take a look at them, and ask yourself, if that's the case and we have this huge change where Mongo is being implemented everywhere, then isn't the world in the future going to need something where it can get off of its MongoDB? And that's the other half of why build Mongo, or build a Mongo emulator. Now, the idea of a Mongo emulator is not exactly new, and Azure, Microsoft Azure, has a Mongo emulator that runs on top of another database that provides strong ACID compliance, and they run it on top of Facebook's Cassandra. Cassandra is awesome at scale, and they certainly run it at scale, since they have one instance of Cassandra running all of Microsoft Azure emulators around the world in all their data centers. And you pay a bunch for this, and it is just subtly different enough that if you decide you want to leave Azure and go and do MongoDB itself, you're going to have to port. So once you've signed up and you've signed on the dotted line for this, it's not open source, it's not yours, and you will continue to pay Microsoft forever, and it is not cheap. We're in another business I was working in, we were paying for 2 developers $600 a month to use their MongoDB emulation layer. And that was just for 2 developers. That wasn't at production scale, because they have minimum number of transactions that they're going to bill you for, and it's billed as a leased product out every month. So Microsoft is not crazy. They see the same problem. They know it's there, and yeah, they're providing a nice, expensive alternative. All right, with that, I will get you a set of links in this week's notes for go and read some of these things and take a look at them. And we will be back with you next week with the beginning of learning Mongo. Aren't you excited about that? I already have Go code that gives demos of all of the things, and we will demo the intricacy of documents and connecting to it and how Mongo works. And that is the plan for next week, is getting way intimate with, this is how you use Mongo.